Ukrainian cultural heritage is not something that quietly settles into national archives. In reality, it is the result of a dramatic struggle against destruction and oblivion. This makes this heritage so magnetic, precisely because it is not always visible or accessible, yet it can be reconstructed like a lost mosaic. In this episode, we talk about what the Ukrainian cultural heritage is and how we can understand it, and also about the role of cultural institutions during Russia's genocidal war against Ukraine. You're listening to the Explain Ukraine podcast. Explain Ukraine is produced by UkraineWorld, an English-language media platform about Ukraine run by Internet Ukraine. Our guest today is Olesia Ostrovska-Liuta, a prominent Ukrainian public intellectual and art manager, director of the art arsenal, Mystetskyi Arsenal, one of Ukraine's major cultural institutions. Olesia regularly appears on lists of the most influential figures in the Ukrainian cultural sphere compiled by various media and rankings. The host of this episode is Tatiana Harkova, a Ukrainian literary scholar at the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy and the head of the international department at Ukraine Crisis Media Center. She also runs the French-language podcast L'Ukraine face à la guerre. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher, editor-in-chief of UkraineWorld and president of PEN Ukraine. This episode is produced in partnership with the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy and the Heritage Ukraine project, supported by the European Union's Erasmus program. Before we begin, a quick reminder, you can support our work on Patreon. You can also help fund our volunteer trips to Ukraine's frontline areas, where we support both civilians and soldiers. All relevant links can be found in the episode description. So let's begin.
So let's first of all thanks a lot for accepting to talk in these podcasts about Ukrainian heritage. So the topic we'll discuss today is about Ukrainian heritage in general and what have changed during the last decades. And my first question would be, let's try to compare what's happening in Ukraine with heritage in different countries and how this Ukrainian situation with our heritage is different, because we live in a country which suffered a lot of periods of amnesia, of things we forget, we lost, etc. What would be your take on this?
Well, thank you for having me. I'm happy to talk to you, Tanya, today. And I think this is one of the most interesting topics, although it sounds, when you start speaking about it, heritage, it sounds very technical in a way, so you think it's going to be boring, but it's not. It's if you look at Ukrainian society, not just history, but society as it is today, through that lens, then you see interesting things. Let me start with a small story and a reflection. It happened, I think, 1 or 2 years before the full-scale war, during the Book Arsenal, and the Book Arsenal is our largest annual event. It's a literary and book festival and affair, which brings together tens of thousands of people, readers and authors and publishers. So it's a large event. And there was a panel during that event. It was about heritage, but also about charity. What's the idea of charity, etc., etc. And when I was sitting on that panel, I was suddenly struck by the idea that I am the first generation who is actually in Ukraine, who is actually inheriting something material, not just family stories, not just the love of your parents, but actual
genetics, so
actual material things, such as old Soviet flats or crystal, vases, and all sorts of tableware, which was a sign of abundance in Soviet times. So people tended to have, plates and glasses, etc. So this is something, or a library from your grandfather, like my husband did inherit. So we are the first generation, I thought, at that moment, who are actually inheriting things. Because previous generations, like generation of my parents who were born right after World War II, they were born to their parents who were dispossessed by the Soviet Union of what they had. They had to go through expropriation of their land. They were small landowners. They didn't have anything more than their, tables and chairs in their
furniture
in their village houses. So they could not pass anything to my parents, hardly anything. And there was a story from my mother who told me the story that when she was very young and thinking about studying it at a university, her father, villager, came and told her that I have nothing to give to you. I have nothing to pass to you. You will inherit nothing from me. So you have to study. This is your only life trajectory. And in the result, our parents didn't get anything from their parents of my parents, especially those who lived in Eastern Ukraine, and Eastern Ukraine meaning everything except for basically the territory of Western Ukrainian National Republic, a political body that existed in the interwar period. They had to go through Holodomor and Soviet expropriations, etc., etc. So there was nothing to inherit materially. And I suddenly felt that this is such a huge change. This is a sign of wealth which did not exist on this territory in Ukraine through the 20th century. And it was exactly before the big war, the full-scale invasion. And now we are not that generation anymore, because many cities are ruined. Material wealth is destroyed on immense scale. So once again, this heritage is not there, and you cannot inherit it. So we are, in a sense, as a society, Ukrainians, and this land where we live, we are a place where there are continuing waves and waves of dispossession and destruction of material wealth. It concerns both cultural heritage and just usual things as well. Therefore, this is pretty much also how we exist.
Yeah, the fundamental question, how do you live in a situation where there is nothing to inherit? And this is also about tradition, because when we talk about, a house to inherit, this is not about walls, right? It's also about this kind of idea of the house, right? This idea of, architecture, idea of things which are around us. I think you are absolutely true about this chance our generation had to inherit something, and we lost this chance primarily because there is this Russian invasion, and we have a lot of cities destroyed and a lot of families who lost their homes.
Well, actually, it's not us who lost the chance. We are dispossessed once again.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, but the problem is that how should we think, we people who think about it, try to discuss what heritage is? It's maybe the time to ask the question, if we consider heritage to be something material, as you said, like things, houses, books, furniture, what else, some cutlery maybe, also like something you inherit. But we still talk about Ukrainian heritage and the continuity of the Ukrainian tradition. How can we ask this question about Ukrainian heritage as such, being in this position and being in this geography maybe, right, would make us so vulnerable in this perspective?
Well, I think when we think about cultural heritage, right, it's not only ethnically Ukrainian heritage, it's also Crimean Tatars, it's also Jewish heritage, it's also Polish heritage, and etc. We, as a society, we are forced to, in a way, to deal with bits and pieces. We are forced to think retrospectively about our culture as a field where you have to find every crumble which was lost by Greta and Gansel. and this is what we do. A few years ago, we were doing at the Art Arsenal where I work still, we were doing an exhibition called Boychukism, and Boychukism is a very large and important phenomenon in Ukrainian art history, and it's a movement, art movement, modernist art movement of the beginning of 20th century, associated with one artist. His name was Boychuk. That's why it's Boychukism. And his group, he created a school. They worked together. It's described as Neo-Byzantine tradition because that group, they were seeking to recreate art through pre-modern Byzantine means, in a way. They were making their own paints. They were very interested in Byzantine iconography. They also lived as a collective, so it was serious. There is a large discussion whether it was avant-garde or not. Many professionals would say it was not an avant-garde, but modernist phenomenon. So in any case, it was very interesting, and in Soviet time. Boychukists, they were working with the authorities, so they believed in communist utopia, as most of the artists did in the 20s in Ukraine, and they were painting large-scale Byzantine-like murals in public spaces with obviously communist messages in those paintings, and it was in a way grandiose project. But in the 30s, Mikhailo Boychuk and his group, most of the artists were executed. And not only the artists were executed by the Soviet authorities, but also their artworks were destroyed. However, some of the paintings remained, and some of these sketches remain, and graphic arts remain, and some photographs of the old murals remained, and some remains of the murals can be found in certain places. So those are crumbles, bits and pieces. And there we had this, I think, very interesting curatorial task when we were doing the exhibit. How do you do an exhibit about a grand phenomenon, and by grand I mean just big in scale, physically, having only small artworks remaining of that phenomenon? And I think this pretty much describes how we work with the heritage today in Ukraine. You have to go back. You have to find every bit and pieces. You have to build. It's like a restoration. You restore a mosaic which will never be as full and glamorous as it was in the moment of its creation. You will have many empty pieces, but you can understand the whole. Mm-hmm. One more example, I'll give you an example of the work that my husband, Taras Liuta, who's a philosopher and historian of philosophy, is doing right now. He is researching Ukrainian Nietzscheanism, how ideas of Friedrich Nietzsche were perceived in Ukrainian cultural context. And Nietzsche was one of the authors that were in Soviet Union. They were, of course, forgotten and forbidden. You couldn't have a Nietzsche's book in your house, etc., etc. So there was no research of that phenomenon in many, many decades. So now it's exactly this work. You find every little small element and you put it on your map and you try to map the situation, and then you step back and you hope to have a larger picture of your culture.
Yes, exactly. So when you speak about heritage, you speak mostly about reconstruction of what existed before, and you have only these bits and pieces, and you are to reinvent something which belongs to the past, and you make it present. So you were talking about mosaics. It made me think about Alla Horska, another prominent Ukrainian painter and artist, and literally what is going on is that a lot of her works, which were located in the eastern regions of Ukraine, like in Mariupol and some other cities in the eastern Ukraine, they were literally destroyed just recently by Russian army, I mean, in these last years. So, and you also maybe remember, I'm sure you remember this exhibition at Ukrainian House about Allahorsk and about the mosaics. So we conserve things which no more exist because of this force of destruction, historical destruction, wars, and all these kind of things.
And sometimes we also have to work with not necessarily destructed works, but with the ideas that were not realized. It's it's a case of one of the prominent work by Alla Horska, exactly, but also her collaborators like Halina Sevruk and Opana Zalevacha and others. They proposed a stained glass work for Kyiv University, and it was actually never realized. Even if it was realized, that was only for a few moments. So it's sometimes working with the destroyed artworks, like in case of Boychukism, and sometimes you work with the ideas that were never came to realization.
Like never published as well, never
published some things, but with publishing it's easier when with material production of an artwork, because you still can have a text as a samizdat. Mm-hmm. As they call it in Soviet historiography. But when it comes to an artwork, it's a material object which has to be produced in certain conditions. So it's we're also talking about potential that was not realized to its fullest. And when you were talking, I just thought that we in Ukraine, people working on Ukrainian art scene, we think about 20th century as if it's an ancient time 2,000 years ago, because
exactly
this is how you discover the culture of ancient times. But it's a very recent phenomenon. Like right now, we're at the Art Arsenal we are showing an exhibition about Vasyl Stus, and Vasyl Stus was a poet who died in 1985 in the Urals, where he was imprisoned for his dissident position. He was anti-Soviet figure. And when you think that when he died, it was already in 1985, so perestroika and glasnost, all those phenomena were, starting. They were there. And just 4 years after the death of Vasyl Stus, in 1989, for example, in Ukraine, the most provocative, the bravest, the most controversial art exhibitions took place in museums such as Lenin Museum, etc. There was a famous exhibition of 1989 in Lviv by Andrei Sagaidakovsky and other artists, which was called Defloration, and it was set up in the Lenin Museum, which would be unthinkable of just a few years ago when Vasyl Stus died for being a dissident. So can you just imagine how volatile the situation was also? What was the scale of changes? And how do you, the scale of trauma, for example, at the art community, who were watching their peers going? So it's again one of the reasons why many of the phenomena of 1980s, of 70s and 60s were considered as dull and not very interesting, even on the art scene, was that the art scene itself was so traumatized by first the level of aggression towards them, and then by extreme level of change that happened afterwards, that many on the art scene just didn't want to speak about 80s, 70s, and even 60s. It was seen as a phenomenon that is not so interesting, etc., etc. We have to look in the future. So that also shows the this continuity, that it was hard to keep continuity.
Yeah, because it was an impression that we suddenly no longer live in the 20th century, but you are maybe living in the 21st century directly after, for example, independence of Ukraine and about the end of the Soviet Union. And speaking of Stus, let's not forget that we don't have his heritage at the fullest, because we don't have his latest texts, which he wrote in the Soviet camps, right? So there is still some texts of Stus we do know that he wrote these pages, but we don't have them because we don't know where they are. So, and for every poet, writer, or artist, you can have these pages that we do know that they exist, but we don't have access to them. So this is a different kind of being of this heritage, because it exists, but we don't know in which form and what exactly he wrote in these pages.
Exactly, or whether it still exists. And speaking about Stus again, when he was writing a lot in the prison, but he was of course prohibited from disseminating his texts, so he couldn't basically send them out of the prison. And what he was doing, there were a number of tricks how he was sneaking his texts out of the prison. He wrote on very, very small pieces of paper in very, very tiny letters, very hard to read. We are showing some of them on the exhibit, sometimes on the handkerchief, sometimes of different pieces of clothes, sometimes inside those texts were sneaked out inside toys, for example. So it was just what you are saying. What we got from him, his writings are only those that could be sneaked out of the prison.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And on the other hand, so we are talking about the fragility. So it's a very fragile, this heritage. So it's existent, but at the same time not existent. But how can we explain that? Maybe it explains, at least partly, why all this interest to Ukrainian heritage. Because when you have something which is sometimes material, sometimes not material, sometimes you guess it existed, like Boychukism. I remember I discovered Boychuk, you were talking about, and I was very interested. I discovered that he was a European. He'd been many times to Paris, for example. He participated. You were asking if he was from avant-garde or modernism. He knew all these French painters.
Oh yeah, Apollinaire wrote about him. Yes.
All these guys, and but he was in that context, but then erased from that context, and he was combining many different things, many avant-garde things with very ancient, traditional, like iconology and all these murals and all these things. So and all these things we discover lately that they existed, like Stus, Boychuk and many others, Gorska, and then what we see right now. So let's talk about recent decades. What we see that a lot of people who are really interested in Ukrainian heritage, you have publishing houses which, for example, are publishing, sometimes for the first time, many texts from this executed Renaissance, this generation of Ukrainian poets and writers who were active in 1920s and in the beginning of 30s, which were killed afterwards by Stalin's regime. And we are publishing them. And young people, people who are 20 years old today, they are attracted to that heritage precisely because they didn't have access to that kind of decades before that. So maybe another effect of this fragile heritage is that we are really attracted to it and we are interested to study it precisely because it's not existent.
Well, I think this is very much connected to Russian aggression and what we are living through. And there is, when you are in Ukraine, it goes almost without saying that there is this underlying feeling in Ukraine's public imagination that what Russia is doing, what Russians are doing to Ukraine, they are trying to erase Ukrainians, either symbolically, as they did before the full-scale war, or physically, because symbolically it turned out to be a hard thing to do. So this erasure of your community, suddenly the flip side of it is your own interest in yourself and in your community. So what is our history and what are our founding fathers who were before us, what they did and what happened to them and why that happened to them. So this is the reason why there is this interest towards the figures of the 20th century, all through the 20th century. It started, of course, through 1920s and the executed Renaissance. Once again, it's a literary, basically, phenomenon, which of very viable literary scene of the 20s, which was ended actually in more or less 1937, when 6 and 7, when a few hundreds of authors were killed in a few days, basically. Mm-hmm. And that there was an erasure of the whole literary scene of Ukraine. So first there was interest in that period, in that phenomenon, but gradually this interest spread to other periods, to other groups, to other texts and phenomena. So this is one thing. You are interested in yourself, and what we also witness is that if you do a contemporary art exhibition, speaking about the situation of a human here and today, you will have much less interest than if you do an exhibit about predecessors. Mm-hmm. Probably, well, my interpretation is that the first contemporary art is complicated and abstract. Mm-hmm. Often, you have to have very developed skill to understand it. While culture of the 20th century, this is basically something you learn to understand in school years. You have all those authors in the program, etc., etc. So it's easier to understand, but also sometimes it's a little bit. Now I will be a little bit negative. There is this aspect of escapism. You try as a viewer or as a reader, you need to escape the reality in which you are overwhelmed, by which you are overwhelmed here and now. Into culture of the past, but not of distant past, something which is it is related to your reality here and now, but it's not this direct encounter with the reality that you have. So like yesterday, right? There was bombing in Ternopil, western Ukrainian city, which was largely thought as a safe haven for refugees as well and people living there, but over 20 years died because rockets destroyed residential buildings. Mm-hmm. They just hit, 9-story Soviet buildings where people slept. So this is the reality you encounter every day living in Ukraine, and you don't. You have to be a very considerate person to want to add to that emotional and intellectual load more problem thinking about current moment.
Some frustration from modern art, you mean. Let's talk about institutions. What you were talking about made me think about a recent conversation I have had with a professional from one of the Kyiv museums, and we were talking about museums today, and she explained me we all know about contemporary museums, that permanent collections, they are no more present. So starting from 2022, from a full-scale invasion, they were evacuated somewhere, maybe in Ukraine, maybe abroad. So you basically have institutions which were there to provide this heritage, to show this heritage, which are empty for security reasons. But another story is that during these empty walls, it didn't stay empty. Starting from 2022, they were just opened their doors for modern ideas, for contemporary art, for private collections, for other kind of activities. I don't know if you would agree, but I was told that normally museums, they have as many people right now for these modern exhibits as they had before the full-scale invasion, without permanent collections, Like, you have to reinvent institutions in this situation, So you have to reinvent. So my question would be, what can be done by institutions right now in this extremely fragile situation of being aggressed, and what can be done to preserve heritage, or maybe to reinvent heritage, to produce, to produce some more culture in this situation?
Well, I think many of the institutions are thinking about and doing just that. And even those who do not display their collections, they still research, or I hope so, they still research their collections. And you can produce knowledge through that. This is not so spectacular as an exhibition, but it's still a very, very important work, which is the basis of everything else. So I'm not very pessimist about that. On the other hand, if you think about any institution, not just a museum, but any cultural institution, including a theater or a library, etc., in Ukraine today, one of the most difficult intellectual exercises that we had to do in 2022 was to understand why we as an institution and every other institution have to continue to exist and to work as well. Why? Why do we need to be there? And we had a few answers. We came up with a few, something which we called missions for every cultural institution at that moment. And it's still the case. So the mission number 1 is preserve heritage and culture, which means not only heritage of the past, but also present time practices and also living artists. This is something that you are doing as a PAN member with your trips to front lines, where you go to libraries to bring books there, preserve this book life in this place, or where you are trying to care about living authors as well through the means that you have for that. So this is mission number 1 of every institution. So even if you do not display things, you do this care work. Second mission is be a Ukrainian voice on the global stage. Try to tell your story. Try to speak from your experience, both about Ukrainian and global issues. And there you have museums all writers or publishers doing that work. And this is what we feel as the Art Arsenal, what we have to do still at this moment. The third mission is actually connected to what I mentioned before when I was thinking about contemporary art and its role today. But it's still, even if it's not so popular, it's still very important. This work is still very important. And this is this third mission is to reflect on the situation of a human and a human society in the condition in which we are, in our case, in the condition of the war. And this is what culture does. It reflects on the human condition. I don't know if you remember that in 2022, our first public project of the Art Arsenal was a large discussion in May. It was called Our Great Movement. Mm-hmm. And it was, we organized it in the days of the Book Arsenal, our largest annual project, as I already mentioned. Usually it takes place in May. So in May 2022, we thought that we need to open our door and have this intellectual exchange, have this panel to talk about what we have just went through and what we are still going through, to reflect on the situation of a human here in Kiev at this moment. And we thought that it would be a small event, but then suddenly hundreds of people turned up, mm-hmm. because it was important to think and talk about your experience with people who can share it with you and who can reflect on that, not just share, not just cry together, which is important as well, not just laugh together, which is important as well, but also to reflect together. And it was a long panel. It's still on our YouTube. I think it's subtitled in.
So it became a video. So in your archives. So it's also a heritage now, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. This is how you produce culture in the situation. But how do you explain it to you? You need to reflect on the situation of a human being, mm-hmm. and of human society in these conditions. And then there was this fourth mission, which still is there, but it's sort of helping mission. I don't know if that's a correct thing. So it's also to serve as a place where people can just be together and support each other emotionally just through being together in one physical space. So that's also what institutions of culture do, even if they do not display their collections as museums. For example, there was I think it was 2023, there was a beautiful exhibition at the Honenko Art Museum, which is a museum hosting a collection of Western art, mostly classic European art, but obviously you cannot have those artworks on display today. So there was a contemporary art exhibition actually called Meanwhile in the Honenko House, and it was a reflection by the artist of their connection to this museum. And also to the audiences of the museum, and also to the collections of the museum. And what was interesting about this exhibit, it was radically non-spectacular. If you were expecting a beautiful display, it was not it. Mm-hmm. It was...
what it was instead?
You had artworks, let's say, for example, by Stas Turina, who just won Malevich Prize, an important art prize in Ukraine. And what he's doing as an artist, he's using very banal, everyday objects. And in some magical way, he turns a pile of, those little things into an artwork, which is never beautiful if you look at it in terms of, plastic dimension of it. But the longer you look at it, the longer you think about it, a whole world is suddenly erasing from it absolutely magical artistic ability. So that was one of the approaches in that exhibit. You had, old sneakers and the story about those old sneakers. They were embroidered with golden thread for a reason. Mm-hmm. And you suddenly saw a whole world, a whole story behind it. Why I'm saying it, that some, as you mentioned, some institutions chose this sort of instrument to continue to fulfill their mission, as I described. And it was still not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, and maybe the last thing to discuss when we talk about heritage and about the role of institutions. And maybe in contrast with what you were saying in the beginning about our generation being the first generation to inherit something. And then also. So let's talk about memory. Because I think that contrary to many generations in the 20th century, we can inherit at least memory of what's going on. Because even being in this situation of existential threat, aggression, the war, full-scale invasion, people dying every day, Ukrainian territories lost every day, we still have this narrative and we still have this memory about it, right? So as soon as we are here, as soon as Hanenka Museum is organizing all these things, as soon as far as Arsenal, you organize this discussion about movements and you record it and you put it online, and there are people who were there and people who were not there, but they can watch it. So we have this continuity in the memory, in the common memory, collective memory of what's going on. And maybe this is the biggest difference between what's going now and what was happening to us in the 20th century. Would you agree?
Well, so this is definitely a strategy to how do you resist the aggression and attempts to erase you, right, from the earth. You try to do culture. Because when you do culture, you tell your story, you recreate your world. You are there. Many people still do that, and it's certainly a choice of institutions. There are many pitfalls on this path, because it's very hard to keep the line between the festival and reality, between festivities and realities, because you can't be very you cannot forget, you should not forget about the reality, you should not forget about people dying, you should not forget about people fighting. On the other hand, every gathering, every exhibit opening, every literary festival have this celebratory mood in a way. So you have to find this fine line between them. You have to walk this thin rope, not to stop produce culture, but also not to dive into this escapist world. It's one of the tasks of every institution, but also of authors.
Mm-hmm. So this is another way how the heritage of all these people and memory are linked. And so this is the main difference. Thank you very much, Olesia, for this exchange, for your analysis of what's going on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tanya.
This was a podcast explaining Ukraine by UkraineWorld, an English language media platform about Ukraine run by Internet Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher, the chief editor of UkraineWorld and president of PEN Ukraine. Our guest today was Olesia Ostrovska-Liuta, a prominent Ukrainian public intellectual and art manager, director of the Mystetskyi Arsenal, art arsenal, one of Ukraine's major cultural institutions. The host of this episode was Tetiana Oharkova, a Ukrainian literary scholar at the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy and the head of the international department at Ukraine Crisis Media Center. This episode is produced in partnership with the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy and the Heritage Ukraine project, supported by the European Union's Erasmus program. Let me remind you that you can support UkraineWorld on Patreon. We rely on crowdfunding to keep our work going. You can also help fund our regular volunteer trips to Ukraine's frontline areas, where we support both civilians and soldiers. Donations are welcome via PayPal. All relevant links can be found in the episode description. Thank you for listening, stay with us, and stand with Ukraine.